Hello there. Thank you for having me. I will give my presentation in English, and I will try to speak slowly and stay within my allotted time. My topic is about small towns. Much of the research that my academic colleagues and consulting friends do is about large cities, because governments and the European Commission in the past certainly have invested heavily in the larger settlements in Europe. The majority of residents live in small and medium-sized towns, and many of those are in long-term decline. They are shrinking. Some of them are collapsing entirely. So my presentation is about the small town and how the small town can find ways out of long-term decline. I apologize for my camera. I am not yellow, but there's something wrong with my camera settings and I cannot put it right. So please bear with me. I will share my screen now to do a short presentation. It's about 15 slides long and shouldn't take us very long. I hope you can see this. This is my cover slide. So, okay, let's get started. Oops. Hang on. For some reason, I cannot operate the I apologize. For some reason, the screen sharing does not. I'll try this one here.
We can see the screen.
Great. Yes, it just would not want to change the slides. So one of the key European policy strategy is balanced territorial development. And Europe is unique in having a medium and large cities in order to create the wealth that we as populations want. The majority of the European population do not live in the big cities. They live in small and medium-sized towns, about 2/3 of the total population. And 40% of these small and medium-sized towns are stagnating. That means they are not growing, and many of them are actively shrinking. That means they are losing population, they're losing jobs. The people who remain in the settlements are getting older, and municipalities find it very difficult to maintain their basic services, which leads to a further loss of population in smaller towns. And it is interesting, there's research that shows that small and medium-sized towns and cities find it very difficult to obtain support in their struggle against decline. The focus tends to be on the larger cities. Now, there's not much research on shrinking towns because it is not a very sexy topic. There's not much money to be made out of talking about decline. And this is the latest map or research finding that I could locate, looking at population growth up to 2008, just before the global financial crisis hit. And the sample that you see here was drawn from a range of cities. The smallest was 50,000, the largest 500,000 population. And you can see the blue dots. These are These are towns that are actively shrinking. They're losing population. Now, we can assume that this situation might have been affected by COVID, and it would be interesting to see in how far smaller towns would benefit from a migration of economically active people from the big cities to the smaller cities. But this is research that needs to be urgently done. What my colleague Tatsuya and I have found that the global cities, there's lots of research showing that global cities keep on growing. They continue to grow. They hardly ever shrink. The larger cities, 500,000 population and more, have an opportunity to regrow. And I think this is the topic of your conference today, that you're trying to discuss strategies that help larger cities to regrow after their industrial decline. My topic is around for smaller cities. And the smaller cities have no chance to regrow and reach their previous populations. They have to find a way of shrinking smart, and then to try and regrow themselves, regrow the attributes that are valuable and that local people desire. But this regrowing is unlikely to lead to an increase in the population. They will have to find ways of regrowing themselves, but smaller. And without strategies, we believe that small and medium-sized towns will continue to decline. And we have situations, including in Poland, where entire settlements seem to be disappearing because nobody wants to live there anymore. Now, we can think about the idea of regrowing as a strategy cycle. And towns in decline are on the left-hand side there, in the crisis element of the strategy cycle. And the great danger is that they will continue to be in crisis. They will not find a way of getting out of the crisis situation to create new choices. And we have developed a number of models and arguments that should help small and medium-sized towns to get control of the shrinkage process, because if it is uncontrolled, the town will eventually disappear, and create opportunities for experimentation, whether this is through social enterprise or voluntary civil society activity, to find ways of regrowing themselves, but to regrow smaller. Eventually, this will lead to another crisis because nothing is ever linear. The big cities tend to be on the right-hand side of the cycle, and they tend to be able to pretty much generate choices as they go along, because they're able to segment their urban settlements into areas that are in crisis, and neighborhoods and parts of the city, and other parts of the town or city that generate economic choices. I want to give a very brief overview of different national policy approaches towards dealing with long-term decline. The typical approach is a top-down approach, where different departments, whether it is housing, economic development, transport, education, say we have to do something about regeneration, and they issue these top-down strategies which are impacting on local government, that then needs to try and make sense of them and generate collaborative interventions that respond to decline. But quite often these top-down approaches are not very sensitive to the locality. These national strategies tend to be defined at government level or regional government level, and are not undertaken in collaboration with government and citizens. Here is a model of the United Kingdom, where there is a general denial. The government does not accept that it has a problem with urban decline and shrinkage. The UK government talks about a lack of economic growth. And rather than having a national strategy to tackle economic decline holistically, there's lots and lots of different regeneration strategies that are imposed on local government. And local government in return tries to work with its local community to address the problems that are important to them, quite often in sort of against national-led policies. The most obvious one, for instance, is the housing strategy that the UK government pursues, imposing housing targets and housing regeneration goals that are often in conflict with what local people would like to see happen. This is the German model, where the German government has acknowledged a national problem of urban decline, of urban shrinkage, partly due to the unification of East and West Germany. And so you have a top-down approach that reaches right down to the bottom level, reaching inhabitants as a result of recognizing that all settlements, small and large, need support in dealing with population loss, aging population, surplus housing, redundant and derelict industrial units, and so forth. But local authorities quite often develop their own initiatives to deal with the problems that are important to them. And there's still quite a disconnect between national policies and what is important to inhabitants. Now, Tatsuya and I have come up with an integrated model, and that is very much around encouraging policymakers, national policymakers, to make sure that the bottom-up approach is actually working. So asking local government to demonstrate that they are co-producing with their citizens, that they're working alongside local businesses, that they are aware of what local people need and want. And enabling this bottom-up approach that then meets the top-down resources, because small towns and cities cannot do all the work on their own. They need government support, but this government support needs to be sensitive to the particular features of small and medium-sized towns. So what is special about small and medium-sized towns? Well, the first thing is that if a town is in decline, it affects the whole settlement. Unlike large cities, in a small town, you cannot partition off a neighborhood and say, oh, this neighborhood is shrinking and the other neighborhood is growing. If a town is in decline, then the whole settlement is affected by it. You have just one town center. If the town center and the small town is in decline, the whole settlement suffers. Very different to larger cities where you have a number of urban centers. Some of them might be growing, others might be declining. Key issue for small towns is they have very limited institutional capacity, not enough staff, and not the amount of expertise that they need to take risks and to experiment. So compared to larger cities, small towns and smaller cities have a distinct disadvantage in coming up with innovative responses to long-term decline. On the other hand, there are also two advantages. One is short decision-making routes. There's a high level of trust amongst local actors, and that facilitates the informal processes that get things done. And the second key distinctive feature is that local have a strong or a clear local identity. Local people talk about being a mining town, a town where you are mining for coal, or you might be an industrial town where you produce steel, or where you manufacture certain goods, or you are a farming town, or you might be a tourist town. And that identity helps in the strategy process that tries to bring people together to find a way out of long-term decline. And we suggest that there's 3 strategic pathways that small towns can take to get them out of long-term decline. The first one is around co-production. Citizens or inhabitants are the most important resource for municipalities that are struggling with long-term decline. And the slide here shows that co-production is not just about doing things together, where the municipality tells people what they should do, whether this is planting trees or collecting rubbish or cultivating land. Co-production starts with the commissioning stage, where you have a strategic review of what needs to be done, and you agree collectively with your inhabitants what the priorities will be. The next stage is around co-design, where you work with your inhabitants on designing services. There's many examples where municipalities work with not-for-profit organizations, charities, to co-design services for older people, to help them with their shopping, to visit them when they're lonely, to use older people to help with after-school classes for young children. There's many examples where municipalities are working with their inhabitants to support healthy lifestyles. And so co-design is not new, but we should recognize that co-design is part of the strategic review and then leads to the delivery of a service. And the fourth stage then is to co-assess, to evaluate together and agree what the next strategic priorities are going to be. And in our book, we explain this in great detail, and I encourage you to get a copy and read it. Adjusting services. This is an example from Idrija, a small town in Slovenia, 6,300 inhabitants. What they have done is they converted this building here on the market square into what could be called a community center, but it is not your traditional community center because the municipality has no money to employ people to run this community center. So this center is run by volunteers entirely. And the volunteers here, you can see the weekly place-making activity. Municipality provides the stage for local bands to play in the evening, and they provide some play equipment, seating facilities, but it is local people, the local volunteers, who are organizing the entire activities and making it happen. So this can happen on all fronts. You might be aware that community groups are reusing, for example, libraries and turning them into reading clubs and childcare facilities and so forth. So adjusting services can be done with very little additional resources as long as you co-produce the adjustments with your citizens. And the third strategic pathway is right sizing. But for the right sizing, national government must provide financial and legal support, because right sizing is about demolishing residential buildings that are no longer needed. It is about demolishing and decontaminating industrial land that has become surplus to requirement and turning it maybe into green pastures right next to residential units or housing estates, or encouraging local people to cultivate the land themselves. So what I'm trying to say in my presentation is that municipalities can take a proactive stance to deal with these problems. Many of you will be familiar with those views. On the left-hand side is the town center of a German town, Altena, 12,300 inhabitants. On the right-hand side, a Portuguese town, what is it called, with about 9,000 inhabitants. They were part of a project that I led, funded by Urbact, and these are the same towns, co-producing initiatives with their inhabitants. And these are not just one-off events that you see here, but lasting interventions that help to revitalize the town center and rebuild civil society. I would invite you to check out the website, regrowtown.org/network. You can make an application to join the network, and I or my colleagues would get in touch with you. And once you join the network, you have access to knowledge on how to use how to activate society, on how to create pop-up shops, how to do placemaking activities and so forth. There's no financial commitments or no joining fee, but by getting together, you meet other towns in similar situations. And we are already talking about the next funding programs and how we are going to create new networks, for instance, through the BLOK program. So I would like to thank you. And I will stop sharing now because there's no question and answer session. You can reach me through the Regrow Town email and network address, and I will be in touch with you in the near future. Thank you very much indeed.